Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Um, you're all welcome to this afternoon's event. And it's a great privilege for me to be here. Interestingly, I have been asked to MC this session. Why do I say it's very interesting? I haven't done this before. So this will be my first. And so I encourage you all to help me. Let's have a beautiful session. I mean, what a joy it is to MC an event as great as this one. So you are all welcome. I am Dr. Solomon Kofi Amwa, a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, and I'll be MCing this afternoon's lecture. I am very sure that we'll be hearing a lot of interesting things, but as sociologists, we have so much to offer. I mean, and we see things differently. I was thinking about this. The chair. Anytime a carpenter sees a chair, he is seeing wood and maybe some joints and hinges. But the sociologist sees it differently. Once a sociologist sees a chair, the question that comes to mind is, who gets to sit? Who made it? And for who? Who is excluded from the table? So we go beyond the surface. And so our friends who are joining us today, I am sure that the reflections and the ideas that we'll be sharing in this lecture will set us thinking. So without further ado, I want to, at this moment, invite a rep of the head of department to give us a welcome address. So let's welcome Professor Isaac Boafo.
Prof. Chair, Honorable Professor, or should I say Her Excellency Professor Abena Busia, our guest speaker, faculty members of the Sociology Department present, faculty members of other departments present here, our cherished alumni, our dear students, friends of the Busia family, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, you all. On behalf of the department head, I would like to warmly welcome you all to today's event. It is both a pleasure and honor to deliver this welcome address on this occasion of the second lecture of our department's 75th anniversary lecture series. This afternoon, we gather not only to continue our reflections on our department's rich and remarkable journey, but to pay tribute to a foundational legacy, a legacy rooted in vision, scholarship, and nation building. The theme for today's lecture, 75 years of institutionalized sociological inquiry in Ghana, a daughter's perspective, is at once deeply personal and profoundly Historical. It was in September 1950 that the University of Ghana, then the University College of the Gold Coast, formally established the Department of Sociology. At the helm of this pioneering endeavor was Professor Kofi Abrefa Busia, a man whose intellectual foresight and commitment to African-centered knowledge production laid the foundation for what has become the oldest sociology department in Ghana, and indeed, one of the most distinguished sociology departments in Africa. Prior to his appointment as head of department, Professor Busia had already begun to shape scholarly discourse in the then School of African Studies, also at the University College of the Gold Coast. His leadership brought academic rigor and relevance to sociological studies of African societies, and his scholarly contributions to rural sociology, social change, traditional authority continue to inspire generations of sociologists across the continent and beyond. Though Dr. Busia formally exited academia in the 1957-1958 academic year to enter the political arena, his intellectual legacy has remained etched in the lifeblood of the department. We are therefore especially privileged to welcome this afternoon Her Excellency Professor Abena Busia, an accomplished poet, scholar, diplomat, and the daughter of our founding head, as she delivers a lecture that promises to blend memory, history, and sociological reflection in a uniquely meaningful way. Professor Busia's presence here today offers us a rare and prestigious opportunity to see our own institutional story through the lens of one who not only embodies the personal legacy of Professor Kofi Abrefa Busia, but also carved her own remarkable path in global academia and public service. It is indeed a beautiful continuity that she helps us reflect on how far we have come and how might we reimagine the next chapters of sociological inquiry in Ghana. On behalf of the head of department of the Sociology Department, Professor Alhassan Suleiman Anamzoya, I extend our heartfelt appreciation to Professor Abena Busia for honoring this invitation. To all our guests, thank you for joining us to celebrate our legacy, identify our collective scholarly journey. Let us all open our minds and hearts to the reflections that will be shared this afternoon. Once again, I welcome you all and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.
I think we can do it better for Professor Boafo. Thank you so much, Professor Boafo, for that warm welcome. At this moment, I would want to create the opportunity for us to introduce the chairman of this evening's event. And I welcome to the podium Ms. Juliana Ahen to introduce the chairman.
Good afternoon to you all, and you are all welcome. Distinguished guests, faculty members, honored alumni, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. We gather here today at a historic milestone, the 75th anniversary of the Department of Sociology at the University of Ghana. This lecture centers on 75 years of institutionalized sociological inquiry in Ghana, a daughter's perspective. Invites us to reflect on our discipline's profound legacy and its evolving voice in shaping Ghana's social fabric. It is my privilege to introduce our chairman, a pillar of this department, whose scholarship and leadership have left an indelible mark on Ghanaian sociology. Ladies and gentlemen, having acquired his first degree in economics in the University of Cape Coast in 1982, our chairman proceeded to the University of Bielefeld in Germany, where he acquired his Masters of Arts degree in Development Planning, that is in Sociology, and his PhD in Development Sociology in 1989 and 1993, respectively. His works, which delve into critical social issues, have not only enriched academic discourse, but have also provided invaluable insights into the sociocultural dynamics of our society. His scholarly work have bordered on Fulani migrants, social integration, ethnicity, conflict, and consensus building, chieftaincy issues, land management, slavery, among many others. These scholarly works have redefined our understanding of identity, belonging, and social change, and illuminates the complexities of multicultural coexistence and urbanization, grinding theoretical rigor in Ghana's lived realities. His current project is an individual and collective memories of slavery and slave trade. We look forward, Prof, to the findings of this groundbreaking project. As a former head of this department, our chairman stares its academic vision with wisdom, nurturing generations of sociologists while strengthening our institutional foundations. His commitment to advancing Ghanaian-centric sociological inquiry perfectly embodies the spirit of today's theme, honoring our past while engaging critically with our contemporary resonance. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a scholar, mentor, and guiding force, Professor Steve Tuna, the chair for this lecture.
Oh, you can do it better. You can do it better. You can do it better. Great. So, even though our chair is sitting down, before he sits down, we would want to take his initial opening remarks. Prof, you're welcome.
Let me thank the head of department and then the organizing committee for making me the chairperson or chairman for today's. I just arrived this morning from Morocco, so when we discussed my being chairman, I said it may not be possible, but we thank God that everything went well and I'm happy to be back and to join my colleagues, deans, directors, heads of department present, students, colleagues, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. You are most welcome to a continuation program, I would say, of our 75th anniversary program. Sociology department, as you well know, was founded 75 years ago by our distinguished Professor K.A. Busia. And today it is an honor and a great privilege to devote one section of our anniversary program just to celebrate this giant. Indeed, Professor K.A. Busia cannot be put in a box. I have done a number of at least 2 papers trying to write a little bit about his contributions to the Department of Sociology and the Sociology Department with other colleagues and some of our senior colleagues, particularly the late Professor Esiming, and it's overwhelming the kind of person that we had as the founding chair of this department. I'm therefore very happy that the head of department and the organizing committee found it very necessary to devote at least one session to listen to the great works of our giant. Indeed, from my own study, it is very evident that Professor Busia started his sociological inquiry even before he became an HOD, head of department or chair of sociology, as it was then called. But I look forward to today's presentation for one reason. It goes beyond the archives, academic work. We have somebody who is, and family members, you are most welcome. Family members are also here, who can tell us their lived experiences. So it's not only about academic, the phenomenology of our great Professor K.A. Busia. That's why I'm looking forward to listening to what his daughter will tell us, and I'm looking forward to getting greater and more insights, not only from an academic perspective, but in fact also from the experiences. So you are most welcome. I won't talk further, but just to conclude by joining the head of department and the organizing committee to also welcome you to this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We can do better. We can do better. Thank you, Professor Steve Toner, for accepting to chair this session. I believe we are all getting ready. I mean, we do sociology every day, and at every opportunity, it's a sociological situation for us. Even queuing to buy wache in the Vanda city is sociological, because you would always want to reflect on why some people get served first. And you are wondering who gets to jump the queue and all of that. So everywhere we stand or sit, we try to do sociology. And often in those queues, who gets ignored? All of these are interesting sociological things that we do. So sociology teaches us to observe, and not just with our eyes, but with our minds as well. So today we are going to be drawing a lot of insights, like Prof mentioned, from all angles, including the reflections of a family and a daughter, for that matter. So it promises to be very interesting. At this moment, I would want to invite Dr. Rosemond Hiaji to give us a goodwill message. Clap for her as she comes.
Thank you, Dr. Amwa. And good afternoon to us all. This is a goodwill message from St. Anthony's, Oxford University in the UK. St. Anthony's College, Oxford, sends many congratulations to the Department of Sociology at the University of Ghana, whose birth 75 years ago coincides exactly with our own. We feel trebly linked, since not only do we share a common birthday, but your founding chair and first head, Professor K.A. Busia, was also a fellow of St. Anthony's, and your guest lecturer, Her Excellency Professor Abena Busia, was a doctoral student at the college and has been an invaluable advisor to the college on issues of equality and diversity for many years. We look forward to developing and extending the links between our two institutions over the next 75 years. Signed, Roger Goodman, Warden of St. Anthony's College, Oxford.
That was awesome. That was awesome. Thank you very much. I believe it's getting warmer and warmer. We are getting closer to the meat. Yeah. So if you are joining us on any platform, you are warmly welcome. We are still here at the 75th anniversary lecture series, and it promises to be a very engaging conversation this afternoon. At this moment, I would want us to welcome one of us to introduce our speaker for today, even as we get prepared to receive her. Dr. Fidelia Ohime, please do us the honors.
Thank you, Dr. Amwa. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we have been told that our lecturer for today is a daughter of the founding father, we will call him, of our August department. Former Ambassador Extraordinaire and Plenipotentiary of Ghana to the Federative Republic of Brazil between 2017 and 2024, with concurrent accreditation to the republics of Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Paraguay, Peru, Suriname, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Ambassador Busia is a professor emeritus of Rutgers University, the State University of New Jersey, having served 40 years in the Department of English and Women's and Gender Studies, where she served 2 terms as chairman of the department. She was also affiliated with the Department of Comparative Literature and a founding member and former director of the Center for African Studies. She also served on the boards of the Center for Women's Global Leadership throughout its existence from 1989 to 2019. She has received fellowships and awards from numerous organizations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, Fulbright, and Ford Foundations, at the Rutgers University's President's Award for Distinguished Public Service. An internationally acknowledged poet, Ambassador Busia has given numerous interviews and readings on radio, performed and read at conferences, universities, churches, poetry and jazz festivals around Europe, North America, and West Africa, including the celebrated New Orleans Jazz Festival and at the Crossroads Theater Festival in New Brunswick, New Jersey. First published by the late Chinua Achebe, her poetry has appeared in various anthologies and magazines on 3 continents, in West Africa, North America, and in Europe. Her first volume of poems, Testimonies of Exile, was published by Africa World Press, Trenton, New Jersey, in March 1990, and her second, Traces of a Life, by Abena Books, London, UK, in October 2008. Her Excellency is also a philanthropist, having previously served on the board of the African Women's Development Fund. She has also been board chair of AWDF USA, a sister organization to the AWDF, the premier continent-wide foundation, founding African women-centered programs and organizations, and the only one founded and run by and for African women. She is also co-founder of the Busia Foundation International, which is supporting this lecture, with her sister, Akosua Busia, a celebrated filmmaker, and this foundation was established by their late mother, the late Mrs. Na Moko Busia. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Her Excellency, Professor Abena P.A. Busia, to deliver this afternoon's lecture. You are very welcome.
Oh, keep clapping, keep clapping.
Keep clapping.
Let's do it better.
Good afternoon. It is good to see you all here, both in person and online. And I would take the liberty of standing on all protocols observed. However, I would like to single out a couple of people. As mention has been made of me being a poet, I'm very, very happy to see my good friend, Professor A.C. Sutherland, here. You know, when you are a poet, it's a very anxious thing. You write these poems from your heart and you don't know what's going to happen to them. But I have had the wonderful experience of being met in strange places, in airports, on the streets, and so on, by people who have recognized me and come up to me and said, "We studied your poetry at university." And I could always look at them and say, that means you are a student of either Professor A.C. Sutherland Addy or Professor Kofi Anidoho. I thank my two friends for years being the two people who I knew kept my poetry alive, especially here in Ghana. So I was delighted the other day when I was honored by the All African Women's Poetry Festival of having a young woman recite one of my poems and tell me she read it at school. The wonderful trickle-down effect is happening. I'm being read in high schools. I did not know this. This is very wonderful for me. So I thank you. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of two people from my ambassadorial life, at least two that I can see. Her Excellency Anna Bosman, Ambassador of France at the same period I was in Brazil, a wonderful supporter and mentor through the diplomatic life. She did only one thing that disappointed me. You heard the litany of places that I was concurrently accredited to. It's the whole of continental South America except for French Guyana. Because French Guyana is not an independent country, it is a département of France. And I kept trying to persuade my friend that there was some radical problem in French Guyana that she needed to tackle on behalf of Ghana, but she could not come, so that she would send me as her special envoy, because it is literally the only corner of continental South America that I did not touch. I never got there because I didn't have a reason to, because it wasn't mine. I have the privilege, which was a wonderful one, of actually being the first Ghanaian ambassador to have presented my credentials to every single South American president during my tenure. And so the last person whose presence I would like to acknowledge, because it's such a wonderful surprise, is the man who was my defense attaché, the founding defense attaché of the mission of Ghana, Brigadier General Cosmas Al-Hassan, who I know wishes I had not mentioned his name. But and of course, my family, represented here by formerly of DVLA, Kwesi Agyeman Busia, and my sister somewhere, the filmmaker whose film you were watching. So, sometime in the autumn of 1960, I now know it was the 14th of October, in the hallowed halls of the University of Leiden, one of Europe's oldest universities located in a small town in Holland, a 7-year-old girl, proudly dressed in her Sunday best of a red belted wool pinafore with small brass buttons made by her mother, and worn over a white jumper, sporting her favorite only to be worn on Sundays black patent leather shoes, buckled up over white lacy socks, heard the words, "Ik heb gezegd," and jumped to her feet to start the thunderous applause that greeted the speaker at the end of what seemed like a very, very long talk. That little girl was, of course, me. The occasion was the delivery of the inaugural address for the professorship of the Sociology and Culture of Africa of the Department of Sociology and the African Studies Center by none other than my father, Professor K.A. Busia. And those only words in Dutch, ik heb gezegd, which I have since learned are the formal way of signaling the end of such inaugural lectures, were literally the only words delivered that evening that I understood. My 7-year-old English did not rise to the erudition of sociological discourse, but simple Dutch I could already understand. It is a daunting thing to be asked to give this address on this occasion, celebrating this department on a day, the 11th of July, which is the anniversary of Father's birth. And I confess my trepidation about understanding sociological discourse was made even more acute by having been present last month to hear the first of these lectures delivered by Professor Kojo Sena on the post-Comtean sociologists and the priesthood of sociocrats. In that lecture, I was personally dubbed the Princess of Sociocrats in acknowledgement of being the daughter of the founding chair, Professor Kofi Abrefa Busia, he, my father, being, of course, supposedly the king. Fortunately, according to Professor Sena, to be a sociocrat is a good thing, and the burden of his talk being to demonstrate the ways in which sociologists are the invisible workers everywhere, without whom little, if any, area of society would be comprehended. His assertion put me in the hand of the anecdote I frequently tell my students to illustrate that one of the most difficult things about sociological research, which tries to uncover the structures of the cultures and social institutions in which we live, is that those structures are indeed frequently invisible. It is an amusing, if cliched, story about an old fish swimming one day in the waters when he passes two younger fish playing together in the same stream. And he greets them in a friendly fashion as he swims past, saying, "Hello, how's the water today?" After he's out of earshot, the two young fish look at each other puzzled, and one says to the other, "What's water?" The point, of course, is that when we grow used to aspects of our environment, we no longer see it, and it takes a certain kind of wisdom to recognize its presence. Water is to fish as air is to humans, and how many of us parents describe air to our infants, or even think to. It's just there. And until it gets visibly polluted or stinky, we don't even think of it. In this analogy, of course, thinking of it and making us see it exists is the role of the sociologist. So, before I take up the gauntlet of honoring the king of the sociocrats and his legacy, I need to share some other beginnings to this lecture, because that little girl in the red dress is only one of them. And I could begin with even earlier memories, because that memory is from Holland. But I could begin with memories of our home on Legon Hill, surrounded by the red gladioli in my mother's garden. Those were the days when, if you climbed up to this great hall and looked beyond it, you were looking at what could have been the dark side of the moon. What you saw was a sea of green forest, in great contrast to the manicured lawns, flower beds, and well-behaved bushes on this residential side of the campus. Going through the decades, this university is my first home. Atomic Junction and Hachu and all of that over there was not present. It was only forest. The house on Legon Hill is the first home I remember before the politics of the day drove the leader of the opposition off campus housing to our blue house on Zongo Junction. We seldom question the places and institutions we come to meet already present when we are born. To me, Legon has always been here and is the site of my earliest memories, including even of my father. I remember running through the grass to find Susan Niculescu, the closest thing I had to a resident big sister, daughter of the economist, the Romanian economist, Babu Niculescu, part of the international faculty of this university. We were living on Legon Hill among the Baitas, and I'd like to acknowledge, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. I have not seen them in a very long time, and it means much to me that they are both here. So, along with the Baitas, the Totos, and other such families whose fathers' names are now etched on the halls, walls, and quadrangles of this campus in commemoration. It is only now that I'm fully appreciating that in reality, these places are only 3 to 5 years older than I am myself, which is a little frightening. We have grown and changed together, this campus and I. And so how might I, as a daughter, reflect on that growth and change in the light of my father's life? After all, it's perhaps the privilege of very young children never really to have to think about or engage with what their parents actually do for a living. Some of us, for example, have parents who leave the home before we go to school, and then we come home to whoever who's there, and then the people who left before us come home after us and ask us what we did with our day. We are accountable to them, but they are not accountable to us. So we knew that father taught, and he taught grown-ups, which all people over the age of 20 are to people under 7 years old. My earliest memories of school are right here on campus in what was called in those days the demonstration school, one of the few places on this campus which has changed very little over 70 years. I still recognize it, and the tree we used to sing and dance under is still standing there, bold and strong. So, I learned much later that the time of these memories, at that time, Father and his colleagues were already establishing a department of sociology, whatever that was. Here, if I may, I'd like to acknowledge my training as a feminist scholar and make 2 digressions about naming. For naming is a socio-political act. And in a context such as this, cannot be unacknowledged. You must know that there are in truth 3 aspects of the man being referred to here. The man who was our father, who at home we simply called Papa. The man who was a friend to his former students and colleagues, who mostly called him Prof, as you saw in the film. And the scholar and writer and head of department, whose works and words I and others cite. So I would like to clarify that for the purposes of this talk, when I'm speaking of my own memories, I will speak of him as father. And when I'm citing his colleagues, I will call him Prof when they do so. And when citing his works or words in published form, or trying to place him as a scholar, I will call him Busia. And you must wonder why I say this is a feminist strategy. One of the things that feminism has afforded us is to make us conscious, very conscious, of forms of visibility and invisibility. Some of us were trained in the academy to pretend and affect a certain kind of dispassionate neutrality, to speak in the third person, or to speak as if our impersonal voice had no socio-political or cultural implications. Feminist studies has taught us that the personal is political, and everything has socio-cultural and personal implications, and these are the reminiscences of a daughter. Thus said, I would now like to say a word here about the establishment we here separate and unpack even the naming of the department as the Department of Sociology, because it is becoming increasingly aware to me that this too needs unpacking and further investigation. In a very important lecture given by Professor Kwabena Nketia back in 1988 at the proceedings of the inaugural ceremony of the Busia Foundation, held here at the British Council in Accra, in his talk on Busia as researcher, Nketia made a very important intervention about the early research program in African Studies located in the new department. What he said was, ever since he joined the University College in 1949, Busia's ambition was to ensure that African Studies had a proper place in the research program in that institution. That is why he accepted his initial appointment as a research lecturer in African Studies. When he was promoted to the position of senior lecturer and head of the new Department of Sociology, his new dream was to get the university to set up a school of African Studies, within which his own Department of Sociology, as well as archaeology, history, and linguistics would operate as units. Besides their conventional teaching programs, all the departments in the school would promote faculty and student research in African Studies, for he saw this as an era of interdisciplinary collaboration. However, as there was no precedent for the kind of school of African Studies he suggested, his memorandum could not move forward the way he wanted. I want to point out that this is in 1949, a good 14 years before Kwame Nkrumah's celebrated speech on the African genius, which finally set up the Institute, and not as Busia envisioned, a school of African Studies in 1963. Furthermore, Nketia goes on to underscore that, quote, to ensure that the manuscripts of knowledgeable people outside the university who had data on the history, customs, and institutions would be available to scholars at the university, he recommended the creation of a fund for source material, something that was later set up in the Department of Archaeology. However, Nketia elaborates that as the kind of school of African Studies Busia suggested in his memorandum could not move forward the way he wanted, Busia therefore decided to create a research fellowship in African Studies within the Sociology department. He then managed to get Nketia's nomination for this position approved by the colleagues he consulted. And Nketia believes firmly that it was because he himself had an interdisciplinary background, even though it was not as wide as Busia's own, which importantly formerly was in history, politics, philosophy, economics, and social anthropology, with a deep knowledge of literature, music, and the arts. I will return to this question of interdisciplinarity later. But I begin with Nketia because he's making two important points. One, that Busia wanted an interdisciplinary school, something that we know happened much later in places like the University of Sussex in England in the 1960s. That is to say, they started as an institution that didn't have discrete departments as such, but had schools of European studies, schools of African studies, etc. And secondly, that Busia sought and found secure research funding, oh what a blessing, to give people such as Nkentia himself the liberty of time and money to do well the early research on which his later career was based. Nkentia is also on record as saying that in truth, therefore, African studies at the University of Ghana properly started early in the Department of Sociology when Busia ensured the hiring of himself, Ephraim Amu, and Mauri Opoku, all later of the Institute of African Studies, as researchers in sociology in those early years. I want to continue this issue of naming by pointing out that at that same colloquium, Professor K.E. de Graaf Johnson, one of Busia's first students from the second cohort admitted to the program, and again later head of this department, explained that it was only when the Department of Sociology was being established after the aborted attempt at a school that Busia then insisted that it be called a Department of Sociology, strategically avoiding the use of the term anthropology, social or otherwise, because cognizant, in spite of or perhaps because of the discipline of his own degree, of the imperial and colonial connotations that had accrued around the word anthropology as a field of study at that time. Or, as Father put it to me one day, when Europeans study themselves, they call it sociology. When they study those they consider other, they call it anthropology. We doing the same work are studying our own societies. What we do is sociology. I understand, for instance, that for a long time, European scholars asking for visas to Tanzania to do research in anthropology were denied, while those petitioning to do sociology were accepted. Clearly, President Julius Nyerere was of the same mindset. As has been noted often, some of Busia's students, such as Professor de Graaf Johnson, became professional sociologists and even chairs of this very department in subsequent decades. De Graaf Johnson, one of the speakers at the proceedings of the inaugural ceremony of the foundation, already mentioned earlier, on that occasion spoke of Busia as a teacher, and I would like to share with you something of what he said. So the father who disappeared from home to other places was meeting people like Professor de Graaf Johnson. And what he said was, all who in various institutions, various countries, and various times have been students of Professor Kofi Abrifa Busia will testify that he was a good teacher, indeed a great teacher who made a strong impact on his students. They remember him with affection and gratitude. And just as St. Paul the Apostle was proud to announce in his day that he studied at the feet of Gamaliel, the professor of Jewish law, so those of us who have the privilege were always proud to tell people, I was a student of Busia. That is how he began his talk. Towards the end, he declares, our revered teacher believed implicitly in the progress of mankind through education, but education which is liberal and open, allowing people to think for themselves, to respect each other, and based on shared values to develop a dynamic consensus for action. The teacher's passion for enlightenment of his students was not restricted to the classroom or campus. It was a lifelong mission he took along wherever he went. As he was later to elaborate in the 2007 film, The Prof, A Man Remembered, the first section of which you saw extracts of while we were waiting, it was directed by my sister Akosua Busia. Professor de Graaf Johnson gives a very enlightening description of life for those early students, borne out by the research of Dakwa, Tona, and Asimeng, for whom, for instance, emphasizing the close relationships they had with the faculty and the many ways in which they were supported personally and professionally, a privilege of intimacy enabled by their smallness of size and the conviction of the importance of the field of study they were establishing. And of course, we have to acknowledge at a time when universities were supported. I must mention that Professor Akosua Dakwa of Dakwa, Tona, and Asimem in question, also once head of this department, is the daughter of the Mr. Dakwa you had been watching, who was father's research assistant in those early years immediately before and after he left the university. Again, as a child, I remember Mr. Dakwa in Holland and Mexico coming to report to father on the progress of his research. What they were working on at the time, I realized, was the challenge of Africa. And here I have to say something. You know, in our years in Mexico in particular, we were between schools. Father, when he first left here, we went to Holland for 3 years. And he was first at the Institute of Social Studies and then became also concurrently the inaugural chair, professor of the Sociology and Culture of Africa. He had to resign that position because he had promised the university that he would make no political statements while occupying that chair, given the situation in Ghana and that Holland still had close diplomatic ties. So it was in 1962, at the arrest of Modesto Apalu and the people arrested with him, that Papa felt the need that as leader of the opposition he needed to speak. So he resigned his chair. And he went from there on a fellowship to Mexico City, where he was one of the founding professors of the Institute of African Studies at El Colegio de Mexico. There are 2 places in the world, 2 foreign universities in the world, where father's photograph appears. One is Leiden University at the African Studies Center, and the other was at the African Studies Center at El Colegio de Mexico. And father tells a wonderful story, actually, that's just come to my mind, of when he became Prime Minister. He was attending a reception, and where everybody was well behaved, you know, the protocol was observed, until the Mexican ambassador walked in, excited, and broke all protocol and addressed him as Prof, because father had taught him while at Mexico. Anyway, digressions aside, as what the point I was trying to make is that we have people in that film, including Professors Nketia and De Graaf Johnson and Mr. Dakwa, Papa's research assistant, who I remember not only from here but from abroad. And we have it on film. And those excerpts are from a documentary which you can access as of today. We are taking this opportunity of the birthday and this occasion to launch Prince of Peace Productions YouTube channel. So if you missed it, you can look for Prince of Peace Productions on YouTube and catch what you missed. On that same occasion, Professor Nketia, in the same lecture already cited, gave a very wide-ranging account of Busia as a researcher, which underscored the nature of Busia as a mentor, ready to share his very wide scope of interdisciplinary learning, which went well beyond the field of specialization. And mentoring people is something that Father did to all his children, including us. One of my earliest memories was in Mexico, sitting around the dining table with Papa at the head of the table and his children around it. This is why I told the story about going to Mexico, because we were in between terms. And it was June to December, and we were missing the fall term of school in England. So Papa homeschooled us, and he used to sit us around the table with our, how old were we? 8, 6, 4 years old selves, with our own homework in the mornings. And he would sit at the head of the table. And I realized he was working on the challenge of Africa. But when I became a teacher myself, I realized the extraordinary gift it was of somebody wake up in the morning, trying to prepare lectures or write a book, and being the leader of the opposition in exile and so on, and still getting his children around the table to say, you do your homework while I do mine. You know. So what does it mean to meditate on the theme of this anniversary year, 75 years of institutionalized sociological inquiry, from the perspective of a campus child, an absent adolescent and student, and a scholar in foreign lands, working in fields sometimes parallel, sometimes intersecting? I need to pause. Which of my wonderful colleagues has left their phone up here? Because it has been ringing, and I feel bad if it's important. I don't know whose phone it is, but it's not mine. If you're not missing it, that's fine. But if you are, it's up here. So, I am a humanities scholar, best known as a professor of literatures in English, and as you heard, a poet, having done my bachelor's in English at St. Anne's College in Oxford. However, it is also an open secret that my doctorate is in social anthropology, not English, the same field as my father's, from the same university, Oxford. Father, after teaching at Wesley College, Kumasi, and getting an external BA degree from the University of London in history, read for a BA in PPE at University College, Oxford, where his economics tutor was a young Harold Wilson, later Prime Minister of England. Father then read anthropology at Nuffield College under the direction of E. Evans Pritchard and Maya Fortes, and the tutelage of Radcliffe Brown and R. Marrett. It was not until his first exile after leaving the Netherlands that he became a Fellow of St. Anthony's College at the invitation of one Kenneth Kirkwood, the inaugural Rhodes Professor of Race Relations, who a decade and a half later was to become my own dissertation director when I entered St. Anthony's College as a graduate student 6 weeks after Father's death. As you see, my sociologists, I'm learning that in sociology and anthropology, maybe more than other disciplines, the roll call of names such as Rattray, Malinowski, Tyler, Radcliffe Brown, and Herskovits do indeed signify much. I didn't realize how much until about 34 years ago, until 34 years ago, when my tenure as an associate professor at Rutgers only recently secured, I was asked to write an entry on my father for the International Dictionary of Anthropologists, no less, if I may be forgiven that in this company. Still self-conscious as I was as a novitiate, reading back on it this week, I realized that I did a better job than I remembered. I have therefore taken the liberty of quoting myself freely at times and basing some of what I say on this occasion on those writings, because I think essentially I was correct. I will pause here, though, to point out that when I wrote this 34 years ago, at the age of 38, feeling green about the ears, my promotion to associate professor just secured, I was already actually 1 year older than father was when he assumed the headship of this department at the age of 37. The reflection is very humbling. However, as you might expect, I've learnt much since, and I have many people to thank, including scholars of this very department, for an understanding of my father's place in its foundation and intellectual development. In addition to Professors Nketiah and de Graaf Johnson already mentioned, I'm indebted to the work of Professor Max Asimeng, twice head of this department, who is one of the few people who has reflected and published on Busia as a sociologist. Though sadly, such is the fragility of our record keeping, I have been unable to trace even the seminal piece he wrote on that subject in the Legon Observer. So, should any old-timer hear how the Legon Observer, Volume 10, Number 2 of 1978, anywhere on their dusty shelves, I beg you, please take it to the archives of the BAM Library for digitizing, because it is a very valuable edition. We cannot afford to lose that work. I also need to acknowledge Professor Steve Toner, both in his brief history of the department he was kind enough to give me after the launch of these anniversary celebrations, and in his paper jointly written with Darko and Asimeng on the development of sociology and anthropology in Ghana and future trends, both of which have been invaluable in helping me prepare for today. So, educator, sociologist, anthropologist, politician, Prime Minister of Ghana 1969 to 1972. Such is the nature of public life that a great deal more attention has been paid to Busia's political career than to his equally prominent earlier career as an academic and teacher. Yet both were based on the foundations of his Christian faith and the belief this gave him that he was indeed his brother's keeper. The two activities were intertwined, and he was a true activist scholar with a number of firsts to his credit. The first black African to receive a degree from his college with his BA from University College, Oxford in 1941, and in the first class of students from anywhere admitted to the newly established Graduate College of Nuffield College in 1945. He was also one of the first two Africans appointed in the British Colonial Service from 1942 to 1949, from which he did the work for his report on the social survey of 2nd D. Takoradi for the Crown, published in 1950. As we all know here, he then went on to become the first lecturer and then the first professor in the newly established Department of Sociology here at Legon. And my thanks to the faculty here for teaching me that that professorship made him also the first African sociologist anywhere on this continent, something I did not know until Professor Toner's lecture a month ago launching these festivities. That we learn as we go along. That piece of information sheds new light on why we were told as children, and we love to boast of it in the family, that Busia was an acronym for Best University Scholar in Africa. You know, Busia is best known, of course, for his landmark 1950 study, The Position of the Chief in the Modern Political System of Ashanti, a revision of his Oxford doctoral dissertation, which is remarkably, and all those academics in this room will understand how remarkable that it is still in print after 75 years. That book is a classic of its kind, a model of the qualitative study of a true participant observer. However, as his students and colleagues bear witness to, Busia's intellectual life in many respects mirrored the intellectual debates around the formation of this discipline that he helped to establish in this country. He was a social anthropologist establishing a new sociology department in a new university in a country clamoring for independence, a tide in which the professor was soon caught up. The nature of his writing bears this further out. In addition to the countless articles and book chapters, some of which are only now being discovered, Busia wrote 6 books during his lifetime. At least 2 of those, the Social Survey of Secondary Takoradi and Urban Churches in Britain, to which could possibly be added a Purposeful Education for Africa, could perhaps be considered classic quantitative social surveys, bearing testimony to his training as a quantitative sociologist who grappled with the idea of understanding the underlying structures of meaning based on a comprehensive analysis of the facts and statistics, the information that he could gather from that survey data. The validation of this point, to me, came from a surprising source, none other than the celebrated British Africanist historian Ivor Wilkes, who was also here at this university in those early years. Though Busia's social survey has been criticized by some for too much, how shall I put it, numbers crunching and insufficient attention to the power dynamics of the society he was surveying, as would have been possible if he'd embraced a more Marxist approach to his research, that is the critique that has been levied, I was pleasantly surprised to discover the book had a committed supporter in Professor Ivor Wilkes, an admirer of Nkrumah, a left-wing academic himself, who, in conversation with me, made a confession in 2008 that he kept on shamelessly making photocopies of the social survey after it had gone out of print in order to continue teaching it, because he considered it such a model of the form that he believed anyone interested in doing a social survey should study to emulate it. Busia's Urban Churches in Britain, A Question of Relevance, is a study of church life in Birmingham undertaken for the World Council of Churches in 1966. The study was part of an ecumenical research project set out to investigate the interrelatedness between church life and social and public life in a changing society. It is notable that one of the reviewers of this study commented that it was perhaps in his conclusions where Busia evaluates his findings and assesses the effectiveness of these churches in the various categories that we perceive the advantage of being given the reflections of someone brought up in a different culture. For that reviewer, the significance of the study lay in the topics Busia set out for his observations, as well as what he had to say about them. That is, it was his very status as a Ghanaian, steeped in Ghanaian social orders and forms, but working in England, that enabled him to see the issues of urban churches with a different lens. Again, this publication established Busia, for Busia, another first. He became, in that work, the first African to undertake a sociological study of the British, rather than the reverse gaze that we have grown so used to. And again, I did not learn this fact until the terrible day I read Father's obituary in the Times. I mention these 2 survey works because of what the faculty of this department have taught me about the debates among faculty and students alike of the fundamental pragmatic difference in methodology, at least in those early days, between sociology, which, very crudely put, relies on quantitative data for analysis and interpretation, rather than on the qualitative data elicited from ethnographic participation and observation, which are the hallmark of social anthropologists. Nevertheless, it is clear from the readings that although Busia himself had been trained predominantly by some of the finest social anthropologists of his day, he was determined that his students in this new department would be as well schooled in sociological methods and analysis as they were in those of anthropology. Furthermore, as Aseming points out, his publications as well as his teaching show not only his anthropological training, but his firm grasp of classical sociological methodology. However, as Busia's 4 books based on his knowledge of Africa attest, he was also an astute qualitative social anthropologist for whom the details of daily life could as equally be used for an understanding and grasp of the structure of the society. His academic career post-Legon as a sociologist of the culture of Africa, pursued while in political exile, led him to professorships and chairs at institutions around the world, holding the institute, including the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and that inaugural professorship at the African Studies Center at the University of Leiden that I spoke of, as well as fellowships in places such as El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, and lastly, as a fellow of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, as you heard, my own graduate school alma mater. All of these studies would be regarded as much more qualitative, if not even philosophical studies. The Challenge of Africa, A Purposeful Education for Africa, and Africa in Search of Democracy have all 3 recently been reprinted by the Busia Foundation in a 3-volume series entitled Busia on Africa, 2 of them with new introductions from archival papers previously unpublished, which show Busia's on the subject of the books in question, Busia's early thinking on the subject of the books in question. So the 1962 Challenge of Africa is prefaced by a remarkable dinner-time speech on contemporary Africa given at a conference at Johns Hopkins in 1954. And Africa in Search of Democracy is now prefaced by the important address Busia gave on the 15th of June 1965 in commemoration of the signing of Magna Carta for the Society of Individual Freedom. I edited those 3 volumes, and I chose those pieces because of their remarkable connection to the books that came later. And in particular, I remember the occasion of Father giving the Runnymede address because he was still grieving the death of J.B. Dankwa, which had happened in prison some 4 months before here in Accra. So being asked by that organization to speak on that occasion of the signing of the Magna Carta was a particularly poignant for him, given what had just taken place at home. So although I was only about 12 years old, I remember Father giving that address. I wasn't there, but I remember him leaving the house to give it. In those 3 later works contemplating the continent of Africa undergoing rapid social transformation, Busia considered traditional ideologies and practices and the institutions they supported to 2 interdependent ends. He sought to understand the influence of native institutions and systems of thought on the modern nation state, and to reflect on their continuing role in a healthy democratic environment, as he did in Africa in Search of Democracy. Whether discussing purposeful educational planning for modern Africa, as in A Purposeful Education, or delineating the manifold changes of culture, colonial history, and emancipation, or common humanity and morality, as in The Challenge, the questions always asked were, what sort of human being, what sort of society, what moral universe? I was not surprised to learn that of the early classes that father taught, one of them was ethics. The quest for an understanding of the dynamics of social change can perhaps be seen as a key uniting all Busia's seemingly disparate corpus of published works, ranging from parliamentary speeches to cultural and sociological studies, because he grounded his empirical studies on social interaction, whether localized or continental, and on a systematic understanding of the religious and ethical foundation of human societies. In this, one can perhaps see the foundational influence of his Methodist education and training through Mfantsipim Wesley College and his integral involvement with the congregation of Wesley Memorial Church at Oxford, where he first went as a Methodist Synod scholar. He married our mother in that church, also in 1950, which was obviously a very important year for father, and it is the church we attended as children and in which I received my membership into the Methodist Church in 1968. As Ignatius Bafwewa, the then regional minister of Brongahafo, said at the symposium to commemorate Busia's 95th birthday in 2008, Busia was an astute politician, a traditionalist, a distinguished academician, and a true Christian who made the values he believed in and his personal talents reflect on the social life of the people in his country. So this grown-up daughter now realizes that the, at the time, incomprehensible inaugural lecture was marked by the ties to home and the concerns her father felt he needed to address, and which he tackled all his academic life. His was a generation forged by the struggle to wrest the reins of power, including the control over systems of knowledge-making from the colonial powers who control our lives and attempted to control our worldviews. This is what made his commitment to establishing a department of sociology so critical. I heard father say many years later that inaugural lecture at Leiden, given in front of all the dignitaries of town and gown, including his colleagues from the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, was the high point of his academic career. Once again, I owe it to Professor Max Asimeng, twice head of this department, to put that pride in a larger context. For it was not until your current head of department, a month or so ago, in the discussions we were having about giving this lecture today, showed me for the first time a copy of Asimeng's own inaugural lecture, that I realized his was the first such lecture this department had ever given. And he was generous enough to point out at that seminal public occasion devoted to celebrating his career that he should not have been the first person to give such an inaugural lecture for the Department of Sociology. That first one should, of course, have been given by your founding chair, and it had never been done. So the reasons why my father was in exile are now well known, but it was reading that inaugural lecture that made me consider with greater understanding the many complex emotions for my father, what it meant to be giving an inaugural lecture in a university thousands of miles away, when he had been unable a decade earlier to give his own at his own founding institution. He had become head of department in Legon in 1950. He delivered his address as the inaugural professor of African Studies in Leiden in 1960. By 1970, he was Prime Minister of the Second Republic of Ghana, and by 1980, he had been recalled to his village. Such is the passage of time. I started my own graduate work in 1978 and was 1 week late for the start of my first term because I was in Wenchi burying my father. The posters you see on either side of the room show me with my father. Father in his BA robes as an Oxford scholar, that they had the long robes with the white fur. Some of us have the shorter ones, you know. And me in the robes of the Oxford Doctor of Philosophy. The robe is the one my father wore and still bears his name embroidered in my mother's chain stitching. And it was the last gift my father ever gave me. In August of 1978, on the day on which I received the letter accepting me for graduate study at St. Anthony's, my father called my mother and I up to their room. By that time, he had lost his sight to the diabetic retinopathy that had been threatening him for years. He needed her help to do something specific and ceremonial. Good sociologist, good social anthropologist that he was good at creating small rituals to mark the significant moments of my life, and this was one. He asked Mother to get down that robe from where it was hanging in his wardrobe and placed it in his outstretched arms. When he received it, he turned and, handing it to me, said, "This robe is now yours. I want to give it to you now. One day, you will have earned the right to wear it. In the meantime, we will keep it safe for you, and when that day comes, I will put it on you myself." Less than 2 weeks later, my father passed away. 5 years after that, in 1983, when we returned home after my dissertation defense, to which my mother had driven me, she called me to the room and said, "Your father made you a promise, which as God would have it, today he's not here to keep himself. However, I shall keep that promise for him." And taking down the robe, she put it on me, standing there by their bedside where he had stood, doing what my father had hoped to do. It is the robe I have worn for every commencement or convocation since the day I earned it over 40 years ago, and it remains one of my prized possessions. In the time remaining, and I have very little time, I realize, I wish to touch on two things briefly. The way the blessing of the father has remained on the daughter through people who knew and met him, and a reflection on how those encounters marked a new trajectory for the discipline of the humanities and social sciences, which inspired sociology departments a way forward. Amongst my many reflections of my days as a graduate student and faculty member is one at both Oxford and Rutgers. There are three which are intangible gifts, not so much to me as the way they honor the person whose daughter I am. The first of them is on the day I received my master's at Oxford. Wearing my short commoner's gown, I had just started the approximately 15-minute walk from St. Anthony's to the Sheldonian Theatre where such degree ceremonies take place, when approaching me from behind, I saw the eminent anthropologist Professor Edwin Ardener, also in his gowns, so obviously headed for the same place. I paused to greet him, and thinking I was simply making polite conversation, asked him for whom he was attending the ceremony. I assumed it must be one of his own graduate students. He stopped, dead in his tracks, and looked at me as if I had lost my mind, and then said, very gently, but quite firmly, "A former colleague of mine, now recently deceased, has a daughter who is receiving her degree on this day. For whom do you think I'm going to the ceremony?" I was struck dumb. Although I had been to a couple of his lectures, he was not my tutor, and I didn't think he had placed much significance on my presence amongst them in the anthropology department. that he felt moved on behalf of my father to put on his gown and walk to see me getting my MA without even letting me know first, touched me deeply. I felt close to tears, and it is a kindness I have never forgotten. The second memory I have already mentioned, that conference at Rutgers University in October 2008, nearly 30 years later, when I met Ivor Wilkes. He had come across the country from the West Coast in California for that conference, but he had another engagement on the East Coast. When I recognized him and greeted him, he asked to confirm when I was speaking, and he was visibly relieved when I told him the day and time, because it turned out that he wanted to be sure that he heard me speak, because he had left to come to that conference because he knew and admired my father. That was when we had the lunch together and he told me about photocopying the social survey. The idea of Ivor Wilkes crossing the continent for the opportunity to hear me give a professional paper because I was Kofi Busia's daughter was a little overwhelming to me. My last story, also from Rutgers, is of the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who has only recently joined the Ancestors. I first met him decades ago at an African Literature Association walking down the road with Chinua Achebe, who, as you heard, was the first person ever to publish my poetry. Achebe introduced me to him, and the first thing Ngugi told me, which I heard him repeat decades later at a conference at Rutgers, and which has since appeared in print, was that the first line of his first novel came to him as a flash of inspiration, hearing father speak at Makerere University on the subject of African education. Putting together the dates, I realized it must have been around 1962, when father was traveling the continent doing the research that led to a purposeful education for Africa. This reference to Ngugi is a great transition to my closing points. I mentioned that father and I both have doctorates from the Faculty of Anthropology and Geography at Oxford. He in social anthropology, me in race relations. We then developed our expertise in separate fields. He in sociology, I returned to my first love, English, learned from father. The point I want to emphasize is that the present nature of father's comments about social change to meet the needs of our age, all the fields require interdisciplinary cooperation, if not knowledge. The influence of sociology and social anthropology spread to my own field of literature just at the time I came of intellectual age. Vladimir Prop's morphology of the folk tale influenced my early approach to the collective reading of the colonial novels I was studying. Claude Lévi-Strauss ruled, and everything Michel Foucault wrote was new. I'm always proud to point out that I started my dissertation before Edward Said published Orientalism, which came out in my second year of graduate school and became a foundational text of the very new field of postcolonial discourse. My major field of what is now called colonial discourse was simply called race relations when I started, and its emergence transformed the nature of my reading. Through it, I understood my father's inaugural address at Leiden, because he was then talking about the European world of ideas as they affected and infected notions about Africa and what Africans can and cannot do, and our rising challenge to those notions. I studied that dilemma from the realm of literature and women's and gender studies. I mention this here because in looking to the future, I have to ask myself, what is it that I feel we need in this new age of change? The old order is changing again. Can we see what the future looks like, and how will it affect the field? In the 70 years since this department was founded, the world has changed exponentially. In the academy in which I've grown up, in addition to the interdisciplinary field of African studies, which Father advocated for in the early years of this department, there are two other significant interdisciplinary fields which have established themselves in the academy: women's and gender studies and African diaspora studies. In my institution, I was fortunate to be part of them both, and the world had changed so much they were both institutionally accepted. There is no time here to speak to the question of feminism and women's studies, except to say that gender has always been the purview of sociology, for it is, after all, a social construct. But the issue around how to think through women's issues in and out of the academy remains fraught. And I am at times distressed by the fact that those of us already in our 70s or even our 80s who fought so hard for a world in which women's agency mattered, in an academy and policy space based on feminism as active praxis, are looking at a world in which our daughters and granddaughters are being terrorized out of acceptance of that world, beginning with the lie that it is a foreign Western concept. If you look at the agency of African women from our earliest oral and written records until today, there is no way you can say feminist praxis is alien to this continent. 20 years of gathering the materials which comprise the 4 volumes of Women Writing Africa, of which wonderful Sister A.C. Sutherland was editor of the West Africa and Sahel volume, have taught us that, if nothing else. And if you don't like the English word, let us find our own. But let us not throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater and reject the possibility of empowerment by naming ourselves what we do. Naming what we do is the field of sociology, and it is a good thing. In Busia's 1960 article on sociology in a rapidly changing society for the International Journal of Comparative Sociology, he stated that there is a growing realization that social sciences cannot individually answer the questions posed by rapid social change if they work in isolation. The new development is full of promise, but it challenges the argument sometimes put forward that social sciences are autonomous in their respective spheres, as it does the imperialistic claims sometimes advanced for sociology. Social change is the occasion for continuing searches for new, even better techniques and methods. The theories that have come out of women's studies are one such better technique and method. That dissertation that I did all those years ago started the year my father passed away, and it led me to an investigation, first of images of Africa in post-war popular fiction for my thesis, and then for traces of Africa around the world for the remaining years of my academic life. So, Professor Tona, as I promised, you will find me on your doorstep. My last 7 years in Brazil, if they have taught me nothing else, have taught me a need for diaspora studies that can speak to African studies. It is an extraordinary thing to see and witness the survival of our own traditions on the African continent after centuries of separation. I can tell many stories, but I will tell just the one favorite one because I am out of time. But this was the one that will mean most to you. In 2018, I had the privilege of accompanying Otumfuo to Suriname when he was invited for their National Day. Some of you may know Suriname is proud of being the place on the South American continent that has the fiercest and strongest Ghanaian cultural retentions. You can go to a museum in the hinterland that you can only reach by a 2-hour boat ride and find a museum that looks like a village in the middle of the Ashanti region. On this occasion, Otumfuo could not go make that 2-hour boat ride. So everybody gathered in Brokopondo at the point on the river where the Maroons fleeing for their independence and safety gathered to sail upriver into the hinterland away from their Dutch colonial masters. So in Brokopondo, they had called the different ethnic nations of Suriname, and they self-identify as such. They have slightly different languages and so on, but they called them all to perform for Otumfuo. When the program started, and I've told this story often, but the details are important, the MC stood in the middle of the stage and read everything that was going to happen. But then she said, "But we are an African people, so we must begin with the drums." And then a young man came at the side of the stage, sort of where the speaker, imagine somebody sitting where that banner is, not on stage, but at the side of it. And he played the drums. Now, Otumfuo had come with his court, and I was sitting beside the Djabinghini, who, when the young man started playing, started reciting the poem that he was playing on his drums. That he could hear, and he could play all the names of Nyakumpong that were being played on the drums. The chiefs could recite. But the most significant thing was when he had finished playing, the MC came back on stage to announce the choir. So we, the audience, were clearly supposed to be looking forward. But some of us had noticed that as the drummer was finishing playing, an elderly man with a bottle had come and sat beside him. And while the noise of the choir was going on stage, that man poured a libation. It was the most extraordinary moment. Otumfuo jerked his head round and did this to his courtiers. "Did you see that? Did you see that?" Because the libation that here would have to be poured because of the rhythm that had been played was being played 5,000 miles away, after I don't know how many centuries of separation, by a young man who looked as if he'd never left Brokopondo, let alone Paramaribo, and they poured a libation. So at the end of the festivities, when, as you know, we saw the linguist, the Chami, stand up and arrange his cloth to go and speak for Otumfuo, we saw Otumfuo tug his cloth and tell him to sit down. And Otumfuo stood up on stage himself and said just one sentence: "You are my children." Case closed. What would it mean for us as cultural workers here in Ghana to take institutionally more seriously those kinds of connections institutionally? Being in Brazil, if it has taught me nothing else, has taught me the need for an African diaspora studies that can speak to African studies, encompassing courses in sociology, history, linguistics, the arts, even culinary studies. Don't let me talk to you about Dokno in Guyana or Karaje in Bahia. That will be another long talk. So even the culinary studies of the African diaspora, material culture, buildings, what does a sociology of diaspora look like? How would such a concentration rather than the work of individual scholars help us to understand better the shared world in which we live? The Africanness of the rest of the world is not a distant world. We remain continuously interconnected, but do not behave as if we recognize this. The diaspora is part of our water. For Busia to understand social changes and marshal its unleashed forces towards a common good for the survival of humanity, it required communal and international cooperation. It required interdisciplinarity. And yet, at the same time, it required an unshakable faith in our common humanity that inspired him in this field. He believed firmly, as he said at the end of that inaugural lecture with which I began, that he hoped we shall discover every day that every human heart is human the world over, and that there is a deep likeness of mind and spirit which makes all mankind kin. Thank you very much. I may sit down.
Yes, please. That was captivating. Please, let's do it again for Her Excellency, Professor. Amazing, thought-provoking lecture indeed. It's been awesome. And as I sit and listen to our lecturer, C. Wright Mills comes to mind. And I can see the sociological imagination, how she very seamlessly grasps history, and biography together. I mean, it's amazing. And that's what we do. And I find that very interesting. We could clearly see the personal issues becoming public matters when you look at Busia's life. Amazing. Let's clap for Professor again. We would be creating, as our custom has been, a short interactive section where we get the opportunity to interact with the speaker. And so we've heard a lot. The history, the biography, the intentionality of the naming of our department, sociology, was quite interesting to me. Amazing, the talks about decolonizing knowledge, seen through Busia's work and intellectual ideas. The idea of interdisciplinarity was amazing, and I believe many of you may have questions on your mind. We'll take a few questions and responses from our speaker at this moment. So there is a microphone out there. You put up your hand, and we give you the opportunity. You catch my eye. I give you the opportunity to pose your question. Yeah. So while we wait for hands to go up, I have a question for Her Excellency. I'm wondering, as a feminist, have you ever had occasion or reason to critique your father in your work? And if you have, what was it on, or what is it on, or what will it even be on if you were imagining doing so? So we'll take any other, or we will hear Her Excellency on this. On this. So we'll add that.
How do you describe the relationship between yourself?
Okay, so Prof, you can take here, yes, to respond to those two.
That is such a lovely question. Because I have a great Ama Ata Edu story. And I think in telling the story, the two stories, you'll find the answer to your question. When I was publishing my first poetry book, Testimonies of Exile, in 1990, there was literally only one Ghanaian woman whose poetry had been published internationally, and that was Auntie Ama Ata Edu. When we were preparing the manuscript, therefore, my publisher, we were looking for blurbs, and there I was, a Ghanaian who'd grown up in England, working in an American academy. I was an African Americanist scholar, so he was very intentional about who he wanted. And we had an African American poet, a Euro-American poet, and then Auntie Ama Ata Edu were our choices. We heard from the other two very quickly, but I didn't hear from Auntie Ama. I didn't hear, and I didn't hear. And then, towards the end of that year, it was the Commonwealth Literature Association conference was in Canterbury, in Kent, in England. And I was going to it. And I went to it, and the two luminaries who were the guests at that conference were the great Derek Walcott and the phenomenal Ama Ata Edu. And I saw her from a distance, and I was with my publisher at the time. We walked in together. So we walked towards her, and she smiled at us and said, "I know why you are coming to me." But she said, "I have not forgotten, but I need to speak to you." I said, "All right." So she was about to speak. So I said, "I'll come after." So she spoke, and then I came to her afterwards, like this, And then she said, "Oh no, I need to see you privately in my room." I was very surprised and a bit nervous, but later on that evening when she was free, I went to her hotel room. And then I walked in and my manuscript was there. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you know who I am?" And I laughed and I said, "Of course I know who you are." And she said, "No, I mean, do you know my politics?" And I laughed and said, "Auntie, there are certain pages of our Sister Killjoy I cannot read." I don't know if you know our Sister Killjoy. There are a couple of pages where she heavily satirizes Papa in a brief conversation with Edward Heath. It's very painful. So I said, "I teach our Sister Killjoy," and I jump over that passage. She laughed and said, "So you know my politics?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Then why have you asked me to critique your manuscript?" And I said, because I'm a young Ghanaian woman writer. If I cannot ask you what my poetry is worth, who am I going to ask? And she said, thank you for the confidence. You will have my remarks next week. But she looked at me and she said, in agreeing, you do know, don't you, that me appearing on the back of one of your poetry books could get us both in trouble? And I said, yeah, I do. She said, well, if you can carry it, so can I. And she wrote me an absolutely beautiful review on the back of Testimonies of Exile. She, as she is for so many younger Ghanaian writers, she was such a generous mentor. She was such a generous mentor. Yaba Beidu's film about her. You don't see me because as a filmmaker, Yaba Beidu never films the interviewer, but I am the interviewer of that film. I was there when she was buried. When I heard the news, in fact, that day, I happened to be traveling to the Netherlands to give a talk. And I got off the plane landed and we put on those buses to go to the conveyor belt where our luggage was. And my wonderful sister-in-law sent me a message. She didn't know where I was. And so when I got connected to the internet in the thing, this message came from my sister-in-law, Monica, saying, Abi, have you heard this? I know it'll matter to you. Here's where your roots, your cultural roots come out. Because I stood there in Amsterdam airport and did this. And realized absolutely nobody would understand what I was doing. And there was nobody to explain what felt like the great calamity that had just hit my life. And I sat there with my hands on my head, looking like a crazy woman, until my luggage came out. I was alone when I got that news, and it was a very lonely moment. Does that answer your question? On the question of my father, I must confess, the answer is yes and no. That is to say, I have not studied my father's works from that perspective. I have studied my father from that perspective. And I do understand, I do hold the two are different, right? But as a feminist, my father is the one who understood to create the ritual. And at the sake of embarrassing the men in this room, I'm going to tell this story because it's an important story for sociologists. The day I got my first period in England, I'm 12 years old. My cousin, she's my sister, the youngest daughter of the child after Papa, was living with us at the time. She was 6 months older than me and more developed. So this experience had already happened to her. And it happened to me. We were at school. It was after games. We'd just been playing hockey. And suddenly there I was, devastated, because I was bleeding. What on earth do I do? So I went running to Sister Efua, and she took care of me, and so on. And as soon as we got home, she went and told my mother that my period had come. So I went up. Mother was in the bathroom, because the bathroom was also where our washing machine was. She was doing the laundry. And she said to me, your sister has told me what has happened to you. And then she did the mother thing. She told me how to clean myself and told me, how to count the days and all the things that you need to know and how to keep count and etc. And I went to my room. About an hour or so later, Papa came home. And I heard her tell him, after which, and it's the only time in my life I have seen my father shy of me. He knocked quietly on the door. They had been speaking Twi, which I understood. My spoken Twi is not fluent, but you can't talk about me. You know, I had overheard, so I knew what he'd been told. And he knocked very gently on the door. And he was leaning backwards and forwards, like really not knowing what to do, with his hands in his pockets. And then he said, you know, a generation ago, if we had been in Wenchi, on this day, your mother and I would have slaughtered a sheep and called the neighbors to come and celebrate what has happened to our child. And then he paused and said, but slaughtering a sheep seems a little out of place in Stand Lake, doesn't it? You know? And it was a very endearing moment because the father wanted to do something. The anthropologist knew what to do, and the anthropologist knew he could not do it there in a little English country village. So what does he do? He told the story. He told the story of what should have happened to me. And that was my ritual. So, as a feminist, I look at my father's work from the point of view of what he practiced, not necessarily what he wrote. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, that was great. And thank you for answering my question too. We will take 2 more questions if there are any. And please, before you ask your question, you let us know who you are briefly.
Thank you very much. This is David, the Sociology combined with religion students that we pay. Your Excellency, please, I would kindly like to know if your father's aim of establishing a sociology department has been accomplished. Because there have been several instances whereby I read books at the sociology department, and most of the references are not from the Ghanaian worldview, is from the European side. And my second question will have to do with the issue of feminism. Your aim of feminism, which is to make us conscious of the visibility and the invisibility of society. Will you say that the current trend of feminism, which is towards the rights of women in society, and by that, most women are seeing themselves like they are more or less above the women in the Ghanaian society. Do you think that is the main aim of feminism? Thank you very much.
Should I add the other?
I'm going to begin with the way you ended your question. Only a man would have ended the question that way. Or am I wrong? Forgive me, and I don't want to be harsh, but you immediately equate the desire for the rights of women as women seeing themselves above men. This is not true. All we are asking for is a sense of equal. All we're asking for is to be able to ask a question that makes us equal to you and not be assumed that we're trying to be superior and put you down. The day that happens, And I knew I would be in trouble the minute I uttered that F word. I did it on purpose. I almost didn't, but I did it on purpose. And I knew for absolute sure the first person to get up and ask me about it would be a man who would twist the meaning. It happens every time without fail or exception. Would you like to rephrase your question? Okay, sorry. No, seriously. Pardon? What was the first question? I didn't write it down.
Current sociologists.
Yes. Yes. Now, you know, when I did my dissertation, I had an extraordinary dissertation director who had as a mantra, to the point where it almost drove us crazy, but then when we started directing dissertations, we realized how true it was. Dissertations make theses. Dissertations make theses. If you are trying to write a paper and you are enjoined to base it on antecedents, you need to be able to find those antecedents. Okay? I made mention, I am right here in Legon. I'm looking for an article written about your founding chair by an eminent scholar who was twice your head of department. And it was published in the Legon Observer, a journal that came out of this university, and I cannot find it. I could not find it 34 years ago when I wrote the piece on my father, but I'd seen reference to it, so I cited it in that, biographical entry, hoping somebody would find it. But I thought it's because this was like long before the internet, right? 34 years ago, we had no internet. And so I thought, somebody reading this in Ghana will be able to find it. Fast forward 34 years, Professor Tona gives me an article on the history of this department, citing the same article. Can any of us find it? You see, so what happens is that then becomes a ghost reference. I cannot really, fortunately, that man has done other work, so I can quote him from other pieces. But he has written a piece on the sociology of K.A. Busia. And even in the university where he wrote it, we cannot find an article. I went to his archives. I've asked at the library. Can't find it. Now, that is an answer to your question, because you notice I did not quote any Europeans in my piece. Again, that was intentional. I quoted the people from this department and my father on purpose. But I had access to them, so I could. If you are trying to build a curriculum, write a book, the tragedy on the African continent is that it is easier to find the classic works of sociology by foreigners in libraries, online, in, whatever, PDFs, than it is to find works of your peers from Zimbabwe or Algeria or South Africa who wrote. But you didn't on the day ask them for the copy of their paper, and now you can't access it. Our question is one of access. One of access. We need to get more intentional about publishing ourselves. And when we do, you see, here in Ghana, your colleagues can reach each other's works. But can somebody, even sitting in Nigeria, get access to the brilliant work that is being done at this university to cite to their students? It is very, very hard. So you have asked a question that has to do with the politics of publishing and access and the funding. The reason I stressed what Nketia said about Busia finding him research. If you look at the research he did in those early days, that's what gets cited. That's what he built upon. That's what made him famous around the world. But he admits himself, he was given the time and the money. Who has time and money? How many of my fellow colleagues here have got that kind of time and money? It's very, very hard. You know, and I feel bad saying this because there's another side to it. I remember about 20 years ago now, because Otanka Obechebi Lamti was the Minister for Tourism. And we were having a discussion. He was launching the Joseph Project, and we were having a discussion about a passion of mine, and that is teaching the diaspora in the schools. And I got frustrated and said, why don't you just, do something about the curriculum? And I made an ignorant person's comment about the funding of education. And he looked at me and said, look, I am the Minister for Tourism. I would love to have more money. But I am here to tell you, because of the youth of our population, our educational budget already, our educational department already has half the allocation of the ministries of this country. Now, I know struggling through imperfect schools, it doesn't feel like it. But I heard that from a minister in Kufuor's government, that the Ministry of Education had the largest budget of any of the budgets ministries in the government, including the Ministry of Defense. Including the Ministry of Defense. So it's on the one side of my mouth I'm complaining, on the other side of my mouth I have to face the realities that we face as a country. And I don't have the answer. Maybe somebody can go marry Elon Musk or something, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I wanted to end here, but before, Prof, please, you can take your seat. Let's do it again for her. I think when we begin to have lunch, the conversations can continue so that we are able to stick to the time. Before I move to the next item, which is very brief, I would want to take the opportunity to acknowledge a few others, dignitaries in our midst. At this moment, from the Busia family, of course, we may not catch all of you, but I want to acknowledge Her Excellency's brother, Sani Ama Bruce Busia. Give us a wave. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much. I want to also acknowledge Mr. Kwesi Ajiman Busia as well. If you are here, you give us a wave. The famous Akosia Busia. Thank you so much. Great. I will also want to acknowledge Mr. Anani Ejay, Executive Director of the Busia Institute for Rural and Democratic Development. Please give us a wave. Great. Thank you. Of course, Professor A.C. Sutherland. Thank you. Thank you. I want to acknowledge as well Her Excellency Anna Bosman and General and Mrs. Al-Hassan. Like I said, there are many other guests. You are all acknowledged, and we thank you so much for joining us. It's been great having you this afternoon. At this time, I would want to specially invite Professor Sylvia Estajan to help us with a presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I believe we've all had a wonderful time here, an insightful presentation by our dear professor. And thank you all for coming. At this time, I want to invite all the planning committee members to come up stage. Please come up. All my planning committee members, as we do this presentation. So we have this presentation for our guest speaker, and I want to read what's on it before we present it to her. So this is coming from the Department of Sociology on this day of our second anniversary lecture, and it reads, presented to Her Excellency Professor Abena P.A. Busia, in deep appreciation for delivering the second anniversary lecture of the Department of Sociology as part of its 75th anniversary celebrations. Your inspiring words, personal reflections, and scholarly insights have greatly enriched our commemoration of legacy, identity, and academic excellence. With sincere gratitude, Department of Sociology, University of Ghana. Thank you.
Let's do it better. Let's do it better. It is right and appropriate. I mean, it's been a wonderful time, and we are so grateful. I mean, at this moment, we would take the vote of thanks, and I want to invite Miss Emanuela Agbebuku to give us the vote of thanks. Hopefully one day I get to use Her Excellency. Please clap for her.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is both an honor and a privilege for me to deliver the vote of thanks for this sociological lecture. So on behalf of the Department of Sociology, I would like to thank God Almighty for making this program a success and for even allowing it to happen. I would like to thank the guest speaker for delivering such an intellectual and thought-provoking lecture. I would also like to thank the chairman for graciously steering this program to a success. I would like to thank the faculty members here and members of other departments for joining us and for lending their support. To the friends and family of the Busia family, we say thank you. And to our students here today, your presence here is a clear testament to your commitment to academic inquiry and personal growth. Continue to show up and being curious. Thank you all.
Thank you, Miss Emanuela Agbogboko. All too soon, we've come to the end of this amazing session. I want to, at this moment, all of you should join me, invite our chair to give his closing remarks. Professor Steve William Toner. Let's keep clapping until he starts. Let's keep clapping.
Thank you very much, the Master of Ceremony. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, you recall in my introductory remark, I did say that we are going to hear some aspects of Professor K. Busia, which we didn't know. I consider myself to be a scholar of Professor, our founding head of department, Professor Busia, having worked with Prof. Seaman and then Akosia Dakwa. But even in today's lecture, I discovered new aspects about the life of Prof. Busia. I didn't know, for example, about his research activities in Mexico. I'm hearing for the first time about that, and a few other things. So, and I promised you that the lecture was going to be very, very interesting and from a phenomenological and biographical background. And we did that. That was exactly what we got. So I'd like to thank now, before I leave, I would like to throw a challenge. Very often we go to lectures like this, wonderful speeches, and in the end, nothing happens. From today, I would like to throw a challenge to 3 groups, individuals. The first, scholars in the Department of Sociology. We must do a study. There should be a study that focuses on the sociology of the Professor K. A. Busia. This is how giants are built. For those of you in sociological theory, my teacher, a German, whom today is worldwide known, it was his students who wrote about him, discussed his ideas, philosophies, and so on. And out of that, he's now positioned up there as one of the sociological greats. And I'm suggesting that we should, from this meeting, just as we did with scholars such as Du Bois, and we want to integrate their studies, we should have a section on Professor Kofi Busia as a his sociology, and teach it and study it. But somebody has to do the groundwork. Somebody has to. So that is the challenge I'm throwing to the department. The second challenge is to Her Excellency, but Dankwa Busia Institute, and then the family. We would like to really get the chair of Professor K. A. Busia in the department going. I know we have been discussing this for some time now. Kindly let us sit down as a department and then to discuss the issues and see whether there can be an annual lectures or an annual seminar or whatever form it should take, so that this great scholar, this great sociologist, his memory would be with us. And that is how we create scholars and then we write about them. When I teach sociology, urban sociology, political sociology, and in the earlier years, sociological theory, the same critique that the young man gave, I always hear, where are the Africans? So about a decade or ago, when I teach urban sociology, I decided to go and do research on Ibn Battuta and then Ibn Khaldun as part of the African contribution to urban geography or geography of cities, to bring the African input. Our students are requesting for that. So, and we have a scholar here. And luckily, the families, those who can help us, are also here with their biography. We can interview them. Then the third is to the department. Please, representative of the head of department, go and tell him. I say we should have a corner in the library or somewhere where we have the manuscripts, books, and documents of Professor K.E. Busia shelved. So we endeavor to get all of these documents, and then our students can make reference to it. This is how great people, the Max Webers, the Karl Marxes, and all those that we talk about in sociology, this is how they came about. It is people who wrote about them and published their works, made them known, and then it entered into our teaching and academic books. So it doesn't come from heaven. It comes from our individual works. So let's do it. So the challenge I have thrown out, and I'm sure the head of department will follow. In concluding, again, let me come back to also, we have had a vote of thanks, but I would like to thank Her Excellency, also Professor Abena Busia, for the lecture and for inspiring all of us. I entered into writing about your father or our professor funding through Prof. Asimen, who inspired me. He called me one day and just said, let's do this together. And then I joined him. But of course, at that time when we wrote, I presumed that he had already written a few things from the 60s and the 70s. But this particular manuscript, which is 2 to 3 pages on the sociology of K.E. Busia, I also didn't ask him where it was. I presumed he had it. We have to look for it. We have the, I don't know where we're going to get it, but all of us have to endeavor to look for it. But we thank you so much for the lecture, and thank to colleagues and all our students for coming. I know it has been a memorable day. Let's continue. Let's not leave it like that. Let's continue to work on it. Finally, I believe as a scholar, you can put aside ideology, gender, race, and so on to inquire into a phenomena. Just being, we are taught to come back to Max Weber's sociology. We have to be neutral as much as we can. So I know sometimes when our founding father is mentioned, there are some people of different ideological persuasions who want to discourage us. But as she herself has said, as scholars, we should engage. We are not going to say that everything that is there is perfect. We can even bring in aspect criticisms of the work. That is the scholarly enterprise in which we are in. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Prof. Chair. Thank you for steering this session to a close. At this moment, I want to take the opportunity to specially recognize the support of the Busia Foundation for this anniversary lecture. We thank you so much, and we appreciate your support for the anniversary lecture. I almost said hallelujah. If you know, you know. If you don't get it, forget it. Great. So all too soon we've come to the end. At this moment, I want all of us together to take the University of Ghana anthem as we are upstanding. Thank you. We may be seated. At this moment, we will be taking some group photographs. So I will invite the photographers to take care of that. And in a few minutes, we'll take some group photographs. Let's take a few instructions in that regard. Okay, great. So what we'll do at this moment is that Her Excellency will come here, and the dignitaries, invited guests, and faculty members will join Her Excellency to take a photograph. After that, we'll take the rest in front of the Great Hall. Yes, at the stairs, the staircase there. So at this moment, I'll respectfully invite Her Excellency and all those who came to support us. Please join us here. Faculty from the Department of Sociology and other departments, our colleagues from History, Economics, please join us as we take this important picture. Please make sure you are in the picture. Please, our invited guest, please approach the dais and join. Professor Anido, please join us, and all other colleagues from other centers, directors present, please join us in this important photography, please. Cameraman, please hold on for a minute. Okay, thank you. Thank you all so much. Now we'll step out for... I'm inside. Please, let's all step out for the subsequent photos. And please don't go away. We have some refreshment after these photos. Thank you all so much for tolerating me. You've been an amazing audience. Thank you. And God bless you all.